Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Conservation Conversations. We really appreciate you guys being here tonight. Thank you for this webinar series. My name is Ed Pritchard, and I work for Miami-Dade County's Miami Eco Adventures Unit. This webinar series is a joint effort between UF-IFAS Extension, Florida Sea Grant, and Miami-Dade County's Eco Adventures. We will be offering this webinar every second Wednesday of the month at 6 p.m. through December. So again, thank you for tuning in. I just wanted to go through a few housekeeping items before we get started tonight. Everyone in this webinar is currently on mute. We ask for you guys to remain that way. While we do the presentations, if you have any questions, you can type those in the chat box, which you can find on the bottom of your screen on the toolbar. I will be moderating the questions throughout, and we'll be answering these questions at the end of the session with the presenter this evening. The webinar is also being recorded at the moment, and a link to the recording will be sent out within the next week. We will put up our social media handles at the end, so please follow us on social media, where we will be continuously advertising our upcoming webinars. We do have one left this fall in December. We will be advertising that one, but you can register for that using the same link that you used to register for tonight's webinar. If you want to receive an email reminder, we can provide the email address in the chat box, so you can email us and let us know if you want to get an email reminder of those the talks and the times and dates. Now I will turn it over to tonight's presenter, Kasia Williams. Kasia, take it away.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for joining me for today's conservation conversation. My name is Kasia Williams. I'm an interpretive program leader for Miami Eco Adventures, a certified Clio climate speaker, and a born and raised Miami native. Today, we are going to discuss environmental justice in South Florida, both historically and presently. So without further ado, let's jump right in. So first off, let's explain what environmental justice is. The EPA defines environmental justice as the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. Fair treatment means that no group of people should bear a disproportionate share of the negative environmental consequences resulting from industrial, governmental, or commercial operations or policies. People of color and those who live in poverty are statistically targeted to become the victims of climate change, poor and/or hazardous environmental practices, environmental displacement, and much more. This has been evidenced throughout history and continues on even in progressive and urban areas such as South Florida. Those who don't know their history are doomed to repeat it. And with that, let's take a dive into some past examples of environmental justice in South Florida. So prior to the Seminole culture that we associate with South Florida's Native people, there were about 15 Native American tribes who lived in South Florida up until Spanish arrival in the 1500s. These small tribes disappeared within 200 years, either from foreign diseases or enslavement. The Seminole tribe didn't even appear until the 1700s as a result of the scattered various tribes who settled in Florida. The word Seminole is thought to have come from a Spanish word, which means wild one or runaway. The Seminoles also had children and intermingled with runaway slaves or freed Blacks, creating a fiercely protective community. Which brings us to our very first act of environmental displacement. By the turn of the century, the fight for land between settlers and Native people was heating up. Settlers not only wanted access to the fertile land, but also the return of their runaway slaves. The First Seminole War in 1817 was fought in then Spanish Florida when President Jackson attacked several tribe locations and pushed the Seminoles even further down south into Florida. After the Indian Removal Act of 1830 was passed, the US government attempted to relocate the Seminoles to Oklahoma, sparking the Second Seminole War. Most Seminoles relocated by 1842 to reservations west of the Mississippi River. By 1858, when the United States declared an end to the conflicts in the Third War with the Seminoles, more than 3,000 of them had moved west of the Mississippi River. This left only 200 to 300 Seminoles remaining in Florida, hidden in the swamps. The few hundred who never surrendered had to move down to the Everglades. In the Everglades, the Seminoles were forced to adapt in order to survive the harsh and alienating conditions. The traditional house structures that the Seminoles lived in had walls, sleeping quarters, and were surrounded by the community and gathering areas. These were replaced by cheeky huts that were built on wooden stilts to protect them from flooding and dangerous swamp animals. These homes were built out of availability and practicality. Cypress logs and palm fronds were used to quickly build elevated and disposable shelter that could be replicated elsewhere as the tribe was continued to be forced further into the Everglades. After the Third Seminole War, the Seminoles in Florida divided into two groups, with part of them moving to a reservation and becoming the Seminole Tribe of Florida. Those who chose the traditional way broke off into the Miccosukee Tribe of Florida. Both tribes are federally recognized today. By 1896, Henry Flagler's railroad reached Miami, and in July that year, a meeting was held to incorporate the city. The right to vote was restricted to men, and a third of those voters were Bahamian immigrant men. The city was incorporated in 1896 with 440 citizens under the name the City of Miami. Truer colors were later shown with the disenfranchisement of the Black community, loss of voting rights, and the consignment of Blacks to segregated living areas. Shortly after the City of Miami's incorporation, Colored Town arose when land deeds to property within municipal limits prohibited its sale to Blacks everywhere except for that quarter. Colored Town and Coconut Grove remained the only places Black people could live until the late 1930s. Black Miami grew quickly, comprising 25 to 40% of Miami's population in its first generation of existence. And by the late 1890s, the area known as West Grove was home to Miami's early Black Bahamian settlers. Bahamians were brought over with the promise of abundant work, as Miami's land was difficult and foreign for Northerners to cultivate. The Black Bahamians worked at the nearby Peacock Inn and occupied shotgun-style houses, which were thin Bahamian-style 1 or 2 bedroom homes. Many of these homes were built by E.W.F. Stirrup, one of Miami's first Black millionaires. The white folks lived on Main Highway, and the coloreds at the time lived on Charles Avenue behind the Grove Playhouse, where the E.W.F. Stirrup House still stands today. Later, these areas were nicknamed Colored Town and White Town. By the 1920s, there was an incredibly high homeowner rate and a strong sense of community among the residents. Kate Stirrup Dean, who was E.W.F.'s eldest daughter, recalled in an interview that father believed in every family having a house, a yard, and a garden, so you could feel like you had a home. He felt that people became better citizens when they owned their own homes. The population in Miami at the time was around 29,000, and the number of Black Bahamians was 16% of that total population. Unlike in other parts of the United States, Blacks and whites in Coconut Grove had what could be described as a cordial relationship. It wasn't perfect, but the people in Coconut Grove, regardless of race, worked together to establish the first settlement in South Florida. Black and whites even attended church services together for a period of time, and there was no mandated segregation. But in 1929, when Coconut Grove was annexed by the city of Miami against its will, resources to the Grove's Black communities dwindled, kicking off a slow decline. After annexation and through the 1940s, businesses along the once thriving Grand Avenue closed down and houses fell into despair. In the late 1950s, the local NAACP president, Father Theodore Gibson, appealed to white politicians and city leaders for help. Instead, the county demolished swatches of single-family homes and replaced them with concrete public housing projects with absentee landlords. Many of the early Bahamian families moved away through the 1960s and 70s, tearing apart the rich social fabric of the community. Without any investment or homegrown leadership, drugs and crime took over the neighborhood. Some examples of these public housings can be found today down Grand Avenue, directly across from the somewhat expensive Coconut Grove Organic Farmers Market. And now to talk about Old Smoky. Old Smoky was built on 3425 Jefferson Street in the mid-1920s as a part of the Coconut Grove prior to its annexation by the city of Miami. Old Smoky was the Cadillac of all incinerators and opened in 1925 with the promise of incinerating 100 tons of garbage every 24 hours. The news reports had a lot of fanfare, and they highlighted that the furnace was kept burning day and night. The municipal solid waste incinerator loomed over the segregated West Coconut Grove community for decades. Clouds of ash and toxic fumes became commonplace from 1925 till 1970. An estimated 1 ton of smoke and ash was ejected in the air each day by Old Smoky, so much so that there's accounts of ash obstructing airplanes flying into Miami. The smokestack stood where the City of Miami Fire Rescue Training Center is now located, which was only 1 block to the west of George Washington Carver School, which children have attended since 1935, even during the days of Old Smoky. The waste includes dangerous levels of dioxins, arsenic, barium, lead, and a number of other carcinogenics. The plant was finally closed in the 1970s, but only after desegregation forced white children to go to school nearby, and white parents began complaining about the health risks. The West Grove remained segregated until the 1970s, and West Grove was denied access to the city's public water supplies, a deeply discriminatory practice that outlasted even other southern cities. This policy meant that West Grove residents were left to use groundwater pumps that were subject to contamination by Old Smoky's toxins. Much of the refuse from Old Smoky's 300-ton per day operation was buried locally on the sites of what are now parks and schools. But it wasn't until recent years that the city finally admitted that numerous municipal parks, including Blanche and Marie Christmas Parks in Coconut Grove, were built atop the highly toxic waste from the incinerator. Blanche Park, which is a Coconut Grove park located on the more affluent and white area, tested positive for dioxins, arsenic, barium, lead, and the other deadly contaminants. The arsenic levels found were 30 times the state limits. Just 4 days after learning the soil tests turned up traces of deadly contaminants, City of Miami crews urged by Commissioner Mark Starnoff, who, as fate has it, lives across the street, carted away truckloads of toxic soil and paved the excavated areas with a foot of asphalt. Blanche Park has since been covered with astroturf and remains open. Marie Christmas Park, located in the West Grove, was tested after Blanche Park and similar levels were found. Unlike Blanche Park, however, Marie Christmas Park took almost 2 years to reopen. To date, the City of Miami has failed to fully remedy or inform the residents of the dangers of the incinerator's ash contamination, which affected air, earth, and water sources in West Grove and the surrounding area. A little-known study was even published by researchers from the University of Miami School of Medicine that showed rates of pancreatic cancer in and around Coconut Grove that were statistically higher than what they should be, what's called a cancer cluster. West Grove citizens who lived through the Old Smoky era report high instances of cancer in their family and neighbors, yet no form of apology or resolution from the City of Miami has ever been made. Coconut Grove's disregard for West Grove citizens and their environment wasn't just an ill-advised blip in history. In 2013, the company Asher Developments reached a deal with the City of Miami to place a garage for its trolleys in West Grove. These trolleys service the neighborhood Coral Gables and the high-end mall Merrick Park for free, but do not offer their service trolley to West Grove. As a result, citizens of West Grove had to house an establishment that produced pollution and made large amounts of noise directly in residential areas. The trolley garage was not only bitterly fought, but it harmed West Grove's economic abilities by taking up a large amount of space and producing pollution and noise. In 2013, the FTA found that Miami-Dade County, the City of Miami, and Coral Gables violated the 1964 Civil Rights Act because a study was not done to determine whether the trolley garage would adversely impact minorities in the area. As it's probably not hard to imagine, parking lots are hotspots of environmental degradation. On a most basic level, parking lots mean less space for plants and animals, but the environmental impacts go so much deeper. Parking lots are a tremendous source of runoff and pose a threat to bodies of water. The amount, speed, temperature, and quality of water that flows from parking lots and garages after rains are a major concern to the EPA and many other environmental groups, with things like trash, oil, gasoline, grease, all accumulating in parking lots, and they're a danger to the ecosystem. Parking lots are also significant contributors to a phenomenon known as the urban heat island effect, in which artificial surfaces retain the sun's energy in ways that trees and vegetations do not. So now we'll jump a little bit into Virginia Key Beach, which is the neighbor of my work site at Crandon Park. In 1902, a channel was created near Virginia Key to establish direct ocean access to the Port of Miami, which changed and increased the intensity of ocean currents against the island and left it less attractive for resort development. Since the island wasn't developed, it was used as a landfill, and after a series of protests and an impactful wait-in, it was negotiated as the establishment of Virginia Key Beach, a Dade County park for the exclusive use of Negroes, today known as the historic Virginia Key Beach Park. It was the only beach that Black people were allowed to swim in Miami during the days of segregation. It opened on August 1st, 1945. Although the currents off Virginia Key were rough, the sands were rocky, crocodiles were often spotted, and until 1947, the only way to get to the beach was by ferry, Black Miami quickly and ecstatically embraced their very own special and scenic beach. The sweet-smelling sea breezes and clear, refreshing waters were unfortunately short-lived. When less than 10 years after Virginia Key's establishment, Miami-Dade destined the spot as a solution to a long-standing issue the city was facing, which was sewage. Miami was born without a comprehensive sewage plan, and this problem was noticed as early as its inception in 1896. Civic leaders spoke out against the appalling sanitary conditions, and for 30 years, Miami's installed sewer pipes that discharge raw and untreated liquid waste into Biscayne Bay and the Miami River, over 29 sewers. The opening of Virginia Key treatment in 1956 was thus 60 years in the making. The CDWWTP, located on Virginia Key, is the oldest and largest existing sewer treatment plant operated by the Miami-Dade Water and Sewer Department. The plant was rebuilt and doubled in size in 1972. The combination of the still at the time active landfill and the enormous sewage plant quickly turned Virginia Key Beach sour and the water clouded with effluents. The long-term environmental impact has yet to be fully determined. Still, Virginia Key Beach remained a popular and even sacred place within Miami's Black community. The landfill only stopped receiving waste in May 1978 after intervention from the Florida Department of Environmental Protection. Capping activities were completed in 1980, with soil tests finding noticeable traces of arsenic, barium, chromium, lead, mercury, and a bunch of other things I don't know how to pronounce. And most areas have less than 2 feet of cover. As shown by the map on the right, the size of the landfill and the treatment plant take up a significant portion of this relatively small island. In fact, standard operating procedures in the 1950s was to pump that treated sewage into the ocean only 2.5 miles out into the Gulf Stream, making the waters of the only destined beach for Black people to swim at unhygienic and contaminated. A change in state law in 2008 forced the plant to begin taking steps to stop those ocean outflows that sent millions of treated wastewater out. In 1896, Julia Tuttle and Henry Flagler laid out Colored Town, which was west of the railroad tracks between Northwest 6th and 12th Streets. Its early inception saw a thriving population centered around the bustling Avenue G, seen here in 1915. There was a professional office, more than 30 stores, and the Lyrics Theater, which still stands today as a historic site. With population growth, however, by the early 20th century, Colored Town was heavily populated and very poorly supported by the city in terms of roads, public schools, sanitation, plumbing, and electricity. The small parcels of land Black people were allowed to live on was quickly becoming insufficient, but the white community loudly and at times violently resisted its expansion. Buildings in Colored Town were dingy, lacked electricity and hot water, and were cramped and unsanitary. The homes were various one-story wooden shotgun houses that didn't have any indoor plumbing. These slim style homes made room for around 150 people per acre in the 1950s, which was a density 10 times higher than white areas. The streets were dusty and unpaved with insufficient municipal services and a lack of trash collection. With all these factors, infectious diseases and public health issues were very high. As the 1950s were ushered in and desegregation began to take root, many families and middle-class Black Colored Town residents began to escape to better and more clean neighborhoods. And although Colored Town saw a decline in residents, Its economic hold remained strong as Black business owners kept most of their restaurants, stores, and offices in the community. In 1959, in 1955, there was over 350 booming businesses, with the most numerous being medical services and doctors, restaurants, hair parlors, and groceries. Miami's population continued to see growth, with the overall population increasing by 36,000. Expansions needed to be made, and with a sick twist of irony following the Civil Rights Act of 1964, came the construction of I-95, effectively slicing through Colored Town and displacing over 40,000 people. The displacement of the area was devastating to the community. Proximity to highways is a major cause of unhealthy air quality, especially in urban areas. And a report from 2011 found that 6.3% of population in Miami-Dade County lived within 150 meters of a major highway, with 3.4% of Miami-Dade County schools being situated between 150 meters of a major highway. So with that, there was tens and thousands of displaced people, and a New Deal changes in federal housing policy gave local officials the opportunity to relocate those former Colored Town, or what's now known as Overtown residents, to public housing. One such, Liberty City and Liberty Square, was opened in 1937 as the first public housing development in Florida, and also one of the first in the country to house Black people. Surrounding white Miamians demanded adherence to the color line, and in 1939, a 6-foot high wall separated Liberty Square from a white neighborhood to its east. Liberty City also brought with it the rise of concrete monsters. HOC redlining practices also affected the allocation of FHA mortgage loans, which are Federal Housing Authority, and they're intended to support low-income home buyers, but very few of these loans were afforded to Black people. In fact, nearly $10 million went to white landlords who used the funds to secure and develop properties at low cost. While this practice increased the supply of Black housing in Miami, the quality was low. FHA loans financed the construction of small 2 to 3 level apartment complexes that became known as concrete monsters, which were not beholden to public housing regulations. One such of these public housings, Scott Home Sectors 2, is located in the Liberty City area of Miami-Dade County. In 1959, the 21 family subsidized houses were built with a daycare center, a community center, and a healthcare center on 16 acres of land. Scott Carver was one of the largest public housing communities, with mostly low-rise and barrack-style buildings. Over the next several decades, the conditions at Scott's deteriorated as the Housing Authority did not allocate sufficient funds for upkeep. In 1999, the Federal HOPE program brought funding to improve deteriorating public housing by creating a public-private partnership that was intended to develop mixed-income housing. The county proceeded to demolish all of the projects, displacing over 1,000 families. It took 10 years to build Scott Carver's replacement, and in the process, the county had lost track of over half of the displaced families. In 2000, consultants for the Miami-Dade Housing Agency visited the site and talked with knowledgeable individuals. They identified a former landfill just west of the site, a former dump area in the northwest corner of the site, and evidence of car maintenance throughout the entire site. The theory was that people do not routinely contact soil deeper than 6 inches, so this assessment only considered the top 6 inches of soil. And as it turns out, Scott Carver Home Sector was built on contaminated soil. Arsenic, lead, and PHAs were found littered throughout the area, which again housed not only multifamily homes, but also a daycare center and several other businesses. Even the testing method of testing only 6 inches of soil is inherently unjust. Are those in public housing not allowed to plant a tree, create a garden for their family, install an umbrella for shade? To bring things up to current times, in Miami-Dade County, 21% of the population lives below the poverty line. In Miami-Dade County, 48% of households are renters, and the median income is $17,730. Renters often hold on to affordable apartments, even if the conditions are deplorable. Public housing in South Florida is oftentimes substandard and riddled with both health and environmental concerns. Roaches, exposed wires, mold, lack of running water and plumbing, leaky floors and ceilings are regular occurrences in public housing. With Miami's humidity, heat, and heavy rains, mold and dampness is a never-ending battle that landlords have an obligation to manage. Elderly residents make up most of the tenants in affordable housing units, with about 70% reporting a disability. According to the city, about 91% of all vouchers are headed by people of color. Mold is considered an environmental hazard and can cause a number of health issues. Molds produce allergens and irritants and have the potential to even cause asthma. Allergic reactions to mold are common and can be immediate or delayed. High poverty and majority African American zip codes were 6 to 7 times more likely to have asthma than other races. Early childhood exposure to secondhand smoke, air pollution, or indoor allergens such as dust mites, cockroaches, or mold can cause asthma and may be a factor in these higher than average occurrences, as we can see on the map on the right with the higher than average asthma cases specifically located in Black zip codes. Another environmental hazard that plagues public housing is lead. This map of housing units built before 1950 shows the correlation between Miami-Dade's older housing stock and lead poisoning cases between 1996 and 1998. Liberty City, for example, accounted for 23% of all childhood lead poisoning cases. Over 60% of all childhood lead poisoning cases reported were residents of Liberty City, North Miami, the Hialeah Miami Lakes area, Little Havana, and Little Haiti. Those areas contain 20% of their housing stock that was built before 1950. This leads us to understanding that the majority of Miami residents have no clue what their houses, parks, and businesses are being built upon. But when it comes to marginalized people, poor people, and Black and brown people, this problem becomes even more grave. South Florida is riddled with brownfields and Superfund sites, which are defined as abandoned or underused industrial and commercial facilities that are complicated by environmental contamination. And then a Superfund site is a law that's called the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act. It's a trust fund set up by the Congress to handle emergency and hazardous waste sites that need long-term cleanup. Superfund sites and brownfields have contributed to widespread groundwater contamination in the Biscayne Aquifer, which is the only source of drinking water for several counties, including Miami-Dade County. The contamination has even caused the shutdown of several well fields, including the well fields at Preston and Hialeah water treatment plants. This image on the left shows some of the Superfund sites located in South Florida. These sites are either remedied or removed. With Miami's constantly growing population, both historically and now, communities have to be built on these sites. In an ideal world, the sites would be remedied before development occurs. But in the real world, these sites were designated for poor and Black people and neighborhoods. Miami has 14 Superfund sites listed on the EPA website. A majority of these are located in low income and/or Black predominant zip codes. One such of these Superfund sites is the Munisport landfill. It's a closed landfill located in North Miami, adjacent to a low income community, a regional campus of FIU, and Oleta River State Park. In the cities, the city of North Miami allowed this company, Munisport, to operate a landfill on the property that operated from 1974 to 1981. Contrary to the city's expectations, the landfill accepted and buried medical waste and hazardous chemicals along with household garbage. In 1982, the EPA placed the dump on the Superfund list, making its cleanup a national priority. But for years, nearby residents have suffered as waste were dumped into groundwater and piled up to 50 feet high. A 30-foot tall mound of soil exists on the top of the former landfill, and after heavy rains, contaminated water flows from the dump, flooding and contaminating the area. When the EPA released their evaluation, it clearly stated that the land should never be developed and a cap should be placed on the area so toxic chemicals could not leak into the air and water and soil. To this day, that cap was never created. This image of the mobile home community directly underneath the former landfill shows just how close the community is to thinly buried contaminants and trash. In fact, in 1990, an underground fire burned at the landfill for about 6 weeks. Nearby residents reported thick black smoke that burned their eyes and throats and forced them to stay indoors. In many other parts of the world, poorer communities are located at lower elevations and more vulnerable to flooding. But because Miami was constructed as a waterfront paradise for the wealthy, the reverse is true. High-income households are packed along the region's coastline, and historically Black neighborhoods such as Overtown and Liberty City are further inland and at higher elevations. As sea levels continue to rise, there is a fear that wealthy individuals will move away from the shore and displace the people who lived at higher inland elevations, a phenomenon known as climate gentrification. A study of post-Katrina New Orleans even found that gentrification was most likely to occur in the neighborhoods with the worst hurricane damage. Much of South Florida and Miami falls under Zone A, which means just a Category 1 hurricane can cause extreme and disruptive flooding. With Miami being a renter city, a large portion of the population is rent burdened, or paying over 30% of their income towards housing. There's also large clusters of unemployment in certain neighborhoods, a problem that was compounded during the coronavirus shutdown. Hurricane shutters cost between $2,000 to $5,000 to install, with around $5 to $60 per foot for materials and $45 to $100 per hour for labor. Hurricanes, especially rapidly intensifying ones, can leave households with just a few days to find the money for extra food, water, and supplies to prepare for a mandatory evacuation. With climate change, we can expect to see more superstorms, flooding, and life-altering weather effects that require preparation or evacuation. The Federal Reserve estimates that 40% of Americans can't even cover a $400 emergency expense in cash. So what happens to these rent-burdened individuals or families who potentially have no car, no savings, and a superstorm is approaching? They're forced to hunker down and hope for the best with what little supplies they can find. One such example of a recent deadly hurricane was Hurricane Irma in 2017. Irma was a Category 3 hurricane that brought a death toll of 87 people and $50 billion in damages. And although Florida rallied together to support one another after the hurricane, behind the scenes, several unjust and dishonest decisions were made. Miami-Dade's Waste Management Department began dumping millions of tons of Hurricane Irma debris in 6 approved sites that were scattered around the country. But Liberty City's Ponciata Industrial Park was the only site located inside a residential neighborhood. The other sites, 3 were located at empty lots behind airports. One was next to an existing landfill. Another one was inside a largely industrial area. And the 6th one was located right next to a gated residential neighborhood with more than 350 units, including subsidized housing. Residents were not told of this plan and only learned of it as they watched the trash heap grow day to day. Reports of pests such as possum and rodents and health concerns were brought to the county, but their cries went unheard. Many of the residents were even forced to switch to drinking bottled water after fears of trash runoff contaminating their drinking water. Even outside of these Superfund sites and hurricanes, environmental injustice can be seen just by walking around different neighborhoods. Although Miami is on a mission to reach and surpass a 30% tree canopy coverage with the Million Trees Miami campaign, this effort is noticeably diluted in certain districts and neighborhoods. This map of tree coverage by zone shows the percentage of trees by district, with the darker green being more tree coverage and the light green at the top being the least amount of tree coverage. Tree canopy is positively correlated with median income, but negatively correlated with the percentage of African American and Hispanic residents. Trees are more than just a beautiful feature in a neighborhood, but they also offer a number of environmental benefits, and things like saving money on electricity bills, reducing stormwater runoff, and they can even increase property value by 5 to 15%. Trees also improve air quality by absorbing pollutants and particle matter from the air. Trees can shade the pavement and reduce air temperatures and the urban heat effect. And just to bring up this map again, we can see the difference in where there is better tree coverage and average household incomes in those areas lacking trees. A 2007 study showed that 6% of Black occupied housing, 5% of Hispanic occupied housing, and 3.5% of white occupied housing reported housing problems such as missing roof materials, holes in the roofs, and broken windows. Having more trees in these low-income areas can help prevent people from having to decide between paying a high electricity bill or putting food on the table. Another reason for these inequitable distributes of the benefits of trees may be the higher initial levels of pollution in minority neighborhoods. As we have seen throughout this presentation, the disproportionate distribution of environmental hazards, including industrial facilities and air pollutants in minority and low-income neighborhoods has been very well documented. Especially right now, the cost-saving benefits of trees could greatly benefit lower-income communities. Over 2,500 households in Florida couldn't pay their electricity bills and had their power shut off during the last 3 months of 2020. Then, in August of this year, FPL announced a plan that would lead to a $692 million increase in base electricity rates. This would raise rates for the consumers 16.4%. And while this is a great step in funding solar electricity, which is their reason for raising the rates, the people whose rates are being raised will likely never see those benefits, as solar panels are incredibly expensive, and the overwhelming percent of low-income renters have no option to install solar panels. This map of carbon sequestration services provided by urban trees show the stark difference that trees can make in air quality. Fossil fuel pollution is not only fueling the climate crisis, but it also kills more people each year globally than HIV, tuberculosis, and malaria combined. Just a little bit about air quality. It's a leading environmental threat to human health. And although Miami-Dade County does have a lower annual ambient concentration of PMI, this amount of air quality can lead to breathing problems, asthma symptoms, which we can see Black people tend to have higher rates of, heart conditions, and even low birth weight. Just as a little explanation, Miami has pretty unique positioning as a Hispanics heavy city. So a lot of this presentation has focused on Black and low income environmental justices. But one significant environmental injustice that overwhelmingly affects a specific type of lower income Hispanic section is farmhands and climate change. According to a recent study from Stanford University, by the end of this century, farmhand workers will suffer on average 3 times as many unsafe working days every summer as they do now. Days where the heat index soars above 83 degrees. Some other major agricultural producing states, such as California and Washington, have passed legislation that's intended to protect farm workers from elevated risk of heat, but Florida legislators have repeatedly failed to do the same. On average, crop workers are 20 times more likely to die from heat-related illnesses than any other worker, according to the CDC. Farm workers often live in dorms or motels without air conditioning, which is crucial for nighttime recovering. The waiting list for housing is in the thousands, and people often sleep in their cars or tents. Farm workers are often chronically dehydrated, and they often exceed the internal threshold of 104 degrees Fahrenheit. They even have to provide their own drinking water oftentimes because growers may not. Their clothing increases the risk of heat stress because they must wear long sleeves, hats, and gloves to protect themselves from insects and pesticides. One little known long-term effect of farm working is kidney disease. Emory University and the Farm Workers Association of Florida recruited 192 agricultural workers from Florida for a study, and they found that each 5-degree increase in heat index was associated with a 37% increase in the likelihood of acute kidney injury, and about 3% of the workers had urine values that indicated a clinically dehydrated state. This is coupled with the dangerous effects of pesticide application. The area of farmland treated with pesticides increased 65% between 1997 and 2017. And while this pesticide use has been an integral part of increasing yields, it's had a disastrous consequence on many communities and the environment. Farm workers and their families face both immediate and long-term harm from pesticides. Estimates suggest that thousands of workers suffer from acute pesticide poisoning each year. This pesticide exposure has been associated with a number of health issues, including cancer, depression, diabetes, neurodegenerative diseases, and reproductive issues. In the 10 Florida counties with the largest populations of agricultural and construction workers, temperatures became dangerous for heavy labor on 92 to 97% of summer days. Over the last century, Florida's average temperature has risen by approximately 1 degree Fahrenheit and more in South Florida. This number is projected to dramatically grow in the upcoming decades due to climate change. Miami-Dade County has had 26 days with maximum temperatures above 90 degrees during the May through September 2019. Exposure to heat during pregnancy is linked to preterm birth and other adverse birth effects. Heat is more dangerous for older people, and marginalized groups in the US die at high rates in heat waves. But farm workers are not the only ones feeling the injustices surrounding our agricultural practices. One such small rural county in Palm Beach has felt the effects of a controversial agricultural method for decades. In the rural town of Glades, where about a quarter of the nation's sugarcane is produced, citizens have suffered from numerous health ailments due to the seasonal agricultural practice of sugarcane burning. One such sugarcane field is only 100 yards away from an elementary school, on a plot of land that the school district itself leases to sugarcane growers. Nurses at nearby school have had to stock nebulizers to run year-round, and students are often out of school for weeks during burning season due to asthma and allergies. One teacher at a nearby school even recalls students walking with trash bags over their heads to avoid the falling ash. A Sierra Club analysis of Environmental Protection Agency data estimates that the practice of sugarcane burning releases over 3,000 tons of hazardous air pollutions in the region every year, including carcinogenic chemicals. The town even has a nickname for the ash. They call it black snow. According to a 2006 study by researchers at FIU, pollution in the area was 15 times greater during the harvest year than it was at other time of the years. On February 6, 2018, during one school day, plume after plume of smoke billowed into the classroom of Rosewald Elementary. By the end of that day, 6 students had been hospitalized and 9 more had been treated by paramedics on site. A class action lawsuit is currently underway in the region, and in 2020, more than 200 environmental groups, local businesses, and organizations called on Commissioner Nikki Fried to end the pre-harvest burn in Glades. Just as a little background about these 3 areas that are in this class action lawsuit, Belle Glade is 60% Black, and more than 40% of its residents live in poverty. Pahokee is also majority Black with an average income of $39,000 and a poverty rate of 37%. And Belle Glade has a poverty rate of 41%. So looking towards the future after all this somewhat depressing information, although we still have a lot to go in the name of equality and justice, environmentally and as a whole, thousands of organizations have stepped up to fulfill this need, both nationally and locally. But the most significant driving force, however, is you and people like you who are invested in learning and understanding the problems so we can solve them as a community. I want to take this opportunity to remind everyone about Give Miami Day that's happening on November 18th, with early giving open on November 15th. You can go to givemiamidade.org to find an organization that resonates with you and show some monetary support. Over 9,000 from nonprofits have registered to participate in Give Miami Day. So there's a cause for everybody and a chance to learn about some of the amazing work going on in Miami. I want to thank you all so much for joining me today in this discussion. If I rushed through it, I just wanted to make sure we had time to get all this information in. But this is the end of my presentation, and I will now open the floor for any questions you guys have.
Great, Kasia, thank you so much for that very illuminating and well-researched presentation. It is now just after 6, it's about 6:45, so we're going to take this opportunity again to thank Kasia for her presentation and answer any questions that you guys might have on the presentation. Again, you can go ahead and put those questions in the chat. And again, this webinar was recorded. So, if you weren't able to tune in for the entire thing, or if you want to share this, I will be sending out a link to the recording in the coming days. So we will be able to share that. So I'm going to Kasia has already turned on her camera, and we'll go ahead and start asking some of those questions. All right.